July 9th, 2013. It was a Tuesday. My husband had to be out of town, so my sister was kind enough to come with me for moral support. I was newly pregnant and going in for my first ultrasound to confirm a heartbeat. Pregnancy did not come easily for me, so I was particularly anxious. And then there they were. Yes, they. Two beautiful embryos with intact yolk sacs and healthy heartbeats thumping away. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. And just speaking about that moment takes me back to how it felt. And my sister and I were hugging and crying and touching each other's faces and recording the heartbeats. And anyone who's been in that moment knows how incredible it is. And they sounded so alive, and I felt so alive. I felt as though I had reached that pinnacle point in life that we're all striving for. I was pregnant. My husband and I had just bought a home. I was married to a man who cared deeply for me. I had amazing friends. My family was healthy and kind to each other. My business was thriving. It felt so good. I found myself smiling even when I was totally alone. I got to live in that bliss for 3 whole days before my life was rudely interrupted. I was treating myself to a facial of all things, and when it was finished, I walked outside and turned on my phone, and there were probably 15 messages from my husband. And I knew he had a doctor's appointment that morning, and it was very unusual for him to call me that many times. So I immediately called him back, and when he picked up the phone, his voice was shaking, and he said, "Baby, I've got pancreatic cancer, and they think it's already spread." I was completely speechless. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't come up with any words, and he kept talking, and he said, "I'm going to ask 2 things of you. The first, don't let me lose my integrity. And the second, I want you to kiss me when I take my last breath." Tall order. We were living between Miami and DC at the time, so I packed my bags and left on the next flight. We immediately began the search for the best course of treatment, and in spite of all the best doctors we could find, I found myself living a complete contradiction. Here I was watching my husband grow sicker and sicker, and my belly was growing larger and larger. I tried my hardest to be there for him and be a source of comfort and be strong, but I was terrified, and I found myself struggling with my own fears and depression. And a death sentence was not easy to take for a man who considered himself indestructible. Who could blame him for feeling that way? And he grew angry and combative, and my husband, my love, my best friend, my rock, my comforter, was lost, and he became consumed by his illness. Shortly after my husband's diagnosis, my brother-in-law moved in with us. And I didn't know him very well at that point. And oddly enough, when I look back, those were really good times. The 3 of us spent so much time together, and we would laugh thinking we were such an odd trio together, living together, and that the neighbors probably thought that they were a gay couple and I was the surrogate carrying the baby. The laughter itself provided a brief comfort from the intensity of what we were dealing with. And my brother-in-law's selfless gift of his time and care for both of us is something that just can't ever be repaid. Our babies were born on a freezing cold winter day, January 29th, 2014. They were about a month early. My daughter, Ida, was born first, and my son, Cash, second. both of them weighing nearly 7 pounds. So needless to say, I was over being pregnant. I was completely blindsided by how motherhood would hit me, and I felt this depression worsening, but I did as best I could to stay ahead of it. And then that innate animalistic thing that takes over when you have your children took over, and they became my world. One night, I was giving Ida a bath, and she was just looking at me. She had these intense blue eyes. And I felt like she was staring into my soul. Preparing them for bed each evening was a juggling act in the truest sense of the word, and with a lot of screaming involved, mostly from me. And I would bathe one and then the other, and swaddle one and then the other, and you get the idea. But this particular night, when I was bathing Ida, she was just staring at me, and I felt a love that I couldn't comprehend. I didn't know it would be the last time we'd look at each other. And I commented on how strong she was as she demanded her bottle that night. Ida, my sweet, beautiful, blue-eyed baby girl, died in her sleep that night. And I buried my husband 6 months later to the day. My husband and I lived a very stressful existence. It was fun and it was exciting, but it was stressful. We traveled constantly between Miami and Washington, D.C. I own a restaurant here in Miami, and he owned 2 at the time in D.C. We were about to open his 3rd restaurant when we got the news of our babies and his cancer. We spent about a week apart each month, and it worked really well for us. It was kind of romantic. In the initial moments following my daughter's death, I was frantic. I went to therapy. I saw a shaman. I went to church. I screamed. I cried. I spoke to other bereaved mothers. I threw things. I hid things. I begged and pleaded for it not to be true. I cried so much that my eyes were swollen shut. And then finally, I just slept. I've been forced to find a new philosophy on life, and the deaths that I've experienced don't ever leave me. They're a part of the fabric of who I am now. And I long for the days when escape was so simple. I slept constantly. When I slept, I could feel the drool pull up in the side of my mouth and run out onto the pillow. I didn't have the energy to swallow. My mom would prop me up and put water and yogurt in my mouth and lay me back down. My sister had to bathe me. I didn't want to open my eyes because every time that I did, I would relive the terror that was my reality now. Each night I could hear my family and friends gathering at the dinner table, and they were a piece of my world that existed that I knew I had to return to. Those people sitting around that table were my lifeline, and they were my escape, and I knew that. And I never felt so loved. I was woken by a friend who came to be with me one night, and she leaned over and whispered in my ear where I was sleeping and said, "Do you want to put your head on my lap?" I lifted my head, and she sat down. I put it back down and fell asleep again for what felt like hours. I kind of felt her squirming and woke up a little bit, and I could feel her waving someone over. She said, "Can someone please bring me some wine?" Lord knows she needed it. Another friend took time away from her own family to stay with me, to help me piece my life back together and cook and clean and care for my son. I had to find a way to stop grieving, at least temporarily, to see my husband through the rest of his life. And my son, Cash, his personality was and remains to be infectious. He was happy, he slept well, he was sweet, and he pulled me out of the deepest parts of my grief. He was my future and my escape and my hope, and he deserved to have his mother. I woke up one morning and I could hear my son stirring in his crib, and it was quite some time before I could really allow myself to feel anything but pain. So I got up and walked into his room, and he was standing in his crib with a big smile on his face. "Mommy," he said, "garbage truck. Let's go find it." So I picked him up, and we ran outside in our pajamas, and we could hear the garbage truck making its way down our street. And he was screaming and laughing, and I was screaming and laughing and jumping, and we were waving to the garbage truck, and he pulled up in front of our house and waved to us and honked the horn, and then he was off. And I realized I just felt something. I actually felt something besides oppressive pain. And I was present and joyful with him, and I actually felt something. This moment took me completely by surprise, and I began to reflect. Maybe my escape had always been there. It just was more simple than I originally thought. Sandy beaches would never bring me the peace that it used to, but I realized that I could now experience a moment in a way that I never had before. A couple of nights before my husband's passing, we all gathered at his bedside, and we opened a bottle of wine. Actually, quite a few bottles of wine. And we were together, and we told stories, and we laughed at his expense, and we were joyful. And a little while later that night, I went in to check on him, and his eyes were open. I leaned over and I said, "Hi, we're all here." And he closed them again. With hospice in charge and my husband at home in a hospital bed, my mom and I were sleeping on a sofa bed just outside of our bedroom. And the hospice nurse came and woke us up in the middle of the night, and we walked into the room, and his breathing, my husband's breathing, was really labored and kind of spaced out. I grabbed his hand and I stroked his head. My mom held his other hand. And he took this one really deep breath. And somehow I knew it was his last. And I kissed him. And the air just kind of left his body. "Go get our girl," I whispered in his ear. And now, I look back on the past couple of years, and I realize that I did have moments where I escaped. I love sitting at a dinner table with my family. I love laughing with my friends. I love losing myself in my son's joyful world of Batman and construction vehicles and bedtime stories. So I implore you to stop and think that you escaped, maybe even today, and be in a moment, and allow yourself to escape to the present. Thank you for hearing my story.